question for Michael and Jodie. Say who you are. Oh, John Bundy, Glacier Fish Company. And I tend to worry about profitability in these operations. So I was curious with regard to the 3 marketing associations and communities that the TNC works with. What can you tell us about the profitability of from the operator standpoint, and to what extent? It sounds like TNC is subsidizing the operations in a way, at least with regard to providing quota. And so I just wondered about the long-term view the TNC has on how this is going to work out.
Sure. So on profitability, we probably need to do more research than we're doing, quite frankly, on the numbers. We do hear from fishermen that it's allowed them to fish with confidence. It's allowed them to get into their groundfish season without the concern of overfished species and constantly facing the overfished species quota market. So we're hearing very good things. Overall, I think there have been some problems. Black cod or sablefish south is a bit of a problem right now in the fishery, but that's really for just the Morro Bay fishing grounds. But the most has been pretty strong and steady, and I think getting better. And they're starting, the fishermen associations are starting to work together on some marketing ideas as well. They'd like to sort of be able to sell this unique partnership when they're selling fish. Yeah, so the Nature Conservancy it has acquired permits that were held in this region. It made a lot of sense for us to reinvest the quota back into what we thought was an excellent co-management structure of this risk pool to get a conservation bang for our buck, if you will. And we've committed to the risk pool that we're going to find ways to make that quota and those resources available for them for the long term. One of the ways we're doing that is by full disclosure on us divesting of assets. We're doing it because it's a programmatic benefit and goal, but we also have to get under the control rules within the time we have to divest, which is at the end of 2015. So in that period, we'll be selling to probably primarily or optimally to community quota funds. And those quota funds are interested for their own right in investing that overfished species into the regional risk pool. So that's a way that it'll be available for that risk pool for the long term.
I'm Bill Rogers. I teach law here at the University of Washington. Question for Mr. Sones about the treaties. I noticed certainly it's one of the most important environmental cases in the last 25 years in this state. I noticed the treaty right of taking fish has been read to protect the fish in this extraordinary case that the tribes have brought with respect to the culverts, which is apparently designed to protect upstream passage of salmon. Did you comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. Thank you for the question. I worked quite a bit on this in the early parts of the years. I wasn't involved in it and towards the end, but with the Bolt decision, the tribes immediately recognized that with the fact that we would receive half of the salmon, a lot of the interest may go away from protecting this resource as an economic engine that it created in the past. That other economic influences would become more important, which would affect habitat in which the salmon needed in order to sustain themselves. So we've been constantly looking at ways to protect those habitats. Phase 2 of the Bolt decision, I guess it was basically referenced as, and the strongest case that we could bring was against the state in blockage of salmon passage with many of their controlled road constructions. And when we went across the state and we looked at how many salmon passages had been blocked through the development of culverts, it had a huge impact on the sustainability of the salmon resources and was the impetus of what we were trying to do. And we only looked at the culverts that the state controls. We didn't look at private roads or any of that type of stuff. So the state had complete control over the establishment of those. Many of those culverts were put in many years ago and need to be replaced. But I think that has been very significant in drawing attention to the tribes' influence in trying to protect these resources, not only for ourselves, but for the resource itself and for the communities that are involved in utilizing the resource. They've become a very small minority when you look at the influences on the resource that affect their habitat. Fishermen are very small, a small part of that. So I think it's been helpful for the resource plus the people that participate in the fishing, salmon business.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Erik Olson. I'm a member of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. My first question was going to be to Don and ask him what his favorite council was, but I'll pass on that question right now. My question, it kind of touches on Joe's talk, and maybe Don would want to weigh in on the answer to the question too, but it was interesting to hear in the West Coast Trawl Rationalization Program that some of the cleanest fisheries from a bycatch perspective received some of the lowest allocations. And to some extent that was a bit of an issue in our Amendment 91 package as well. I guess my question is, what, if anything, is the council planning to do about that? Or are nice move, Joe. Very nice move. Are they expected to deal with some of the tools like risk management pools and some of the other concepts that were envisioned or described in your talk? So if you could answer that, I'd appreciate that.
Does that help? The council has been engaged. We approached the council with the risk pool concept, but as I mentioned earlier, actually Merrick had embedded in the analysis, and I'm sure with council knowledge and intent, the specific provision that said risk pools were to be treated differently under the control rules and accumulation limits that would be applied by the council. When we came back to the council with what we were developing, we proposed a higher accumulation limit for the pools so that we could potentially carry them year to year under what would be a quota share kind of use as opposed to just quota pound use. And it got a very thorough and I think appropriate airing out with the council, and the decision was to wait basically and see how this plays out for a bit. But in the meantime, we did get some help in terms of just clear guidance on how the rule would apply. And also, I believe in the pipeline, there's a holding account amendment that would, if I remember correctly, the council did adopt that will formalize the structure we use to create these pools of constraining species catch. I can't speak to the allocation decisions that went on. I just wasn't part of those discussions. And I guess what I'd say is, just rather than looking back and saying what I would propose be done differently, I think, as I was suggesting at the end of the talk, I think it's just an important thing looking forward to take a look at the effect of a fishery management plan decision on the community involved and whether or not that effect is going to promote or not a co-management type approach to some of these very complicated issues. I think in some cases the council does very well by providing the hammer in the background, stepping away from the allocation issue for a moment and talking more about performance. And I think you and others on the council have done a very good job of creating performance standards that send a real clear signal. And that, in some respects, if we can really build an effective co-management system, may be the most important thing. In other words, we may find a way to, outside of the accumulation, or pardon me, outside of the allocation process, to resolve some of the difficult allocation issues through co-management arrangements. What really helps us is when the council gives us clear performance standards and clear expectations about what we're expected to do when we do that.
And I might add just a little bit, and then we do have Merrick here, who was one of the key analysts. And so with regard, first of all, to how to allocate the overfished species and whether or not it's a penalty for people who are actually fishing cleaner. The council did wrestle a lot with that, and it kind of came down to, since they are overfished, we need to look at this differently than the other species, and who needs some of these choke species the most? And when you look at somebody who never caught any in the past, is it because they didn't fish in the same area where yellow eye rockfish were, and maybe they didn't need as much? And so there was a different approach, taking a look at who really needed some. That does get into it, and we did get in public testimony a lot of people who said, well, you know, I've been struggling along this line trying to protect yellow eye rockfish, and I have successfully done so, and now I'm being penalized for that because of my catch history situation. So the council heard both sides of that, and I think it would be good for Erik to say a few words about how that went. Then when it comes down to what do you do when these fish come off the overfished species list, and widow rockfish now has come off. And I think originally the idea was, okay, this allocation of overfished species is different than the rest of the fish, where every permit holder got some quota share out of respect for the buyback that had occurred, and then the rest of it was based on catch history. And so let's do something different for these overfished species to try to manage the best we can. When they come off the list, though, it's a new ball game, and the council will take a fresh look at it again and not get stuck with exactly what happened during this kind of impromptu crisis management decision on allocating. I think on the yellow eye it came out to 2.2 pounds per permit or something that got it. So I mean, that's almost less than a fish. Well, now widow is off. There's some more coming off, and the council is still wrestling with what to do with that, to go back to the original formula or not, because it gets complicated with regard to the quota pounds being traded around and business arrangements, you know, maybe being dependent upon some longevity to that, and how do you deal with that? So it remains a little bit of an open question. But Erik, maybe just for accuracy, I tried to say it was a different system and it was based on who needed the fish, but maybe you can clarify some of that. That might be a generalization.
This will teach me to volunteer again. Basically, Don, I think you did a great job answering that. I think the characterization that it was allocated to the lowest, or was not allocated to the lowest bycatch fishermen, I would characterize it differently in terms of what Don said. It's really more about need. The boats off the West Coast are, compared to Alaska, fairly small, fairly regionally specific. So as we know, these overfished rockfish are very patchily distributed. If you're fishing off northern Washington, you need a different set of overfished species than if you're fishing off Morro Bay, California. And so that's how the logic kind of spun into this complex allocation scheme. But I'd be happy to talk to you more about it at lunch.
Dorothy next. So for one chair to the other.
Thanks. Okay, go ahead. So I am Dorothy Loman. I'm with the Pacific Fishery Management Council. I wanted to follow up maybe either with both Joe and Michael about I think the really good story of how well the risk pool has been able to manage their overfished species, get more of their target species out of the water for the use of and proportionately for the use of the overfished species, and in fact have even a lower utilization perhaps of that overfished species, some of which is able to fund some of this good research by having that capability. But there has been a concern about stranding, and Joe reflected upon that and reflected that perhaps the risk pool has been able to then not be in the same situation that some of this individual quota holders are, being afraid to, give up any of that until their last haul. So I was actually glad to hear that you've been able to start to think about how you can allow that to be on the marketplace for others. But I was wondering if you could speak more of how you've been thinking about that, the characteristics, the decision-making process of being able to do that.
I'm going to go first. So the risk pool board or advisory committee is a member of each of the co-ops, and the Nature Conservancy gets to sit on that too, and we talk about how to handle situations like this. this was a first-year situation. This was 2011. The risk pool launched in, I think, June or July, and then so this was a first-year challenge. And what we decided to do is essentially in the second half of the year have these monthly check-ins where we have a meeting, we look at the reserves of overfished species, and we work hard to get that back out on the market. The way we do that is a decision is made. Let's say, listen, we have too much Boccaccio, there's no way we need this. In September, we're gonna take 50% of it, and it goes pro rata back to the people who contributed it. And then it's their prerogative to put it out on the market, trade it with someone else, but just, they're going to get it on the market. So that's how we've handled that. And it's put a lot of fish back on the market. The question I would ask in this, and it's a very important area of inquiry for us here, is it more likely that a collective group managing a collective pool of fish would be more likely to release their excess as compared to an individual with a very small amount that has very little margin of error? That larger group has a margin of error. We actually have a plan in place to do something if we exhaust one of our quota resources. That is to work together to raise the resources to buy more. That individual, I can't, if I were an individual fisherman, I'd never let go of my yellow eye. I would never let go of my canary until the very last tow or close to it.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add. I think Michael covered it.
I'm Lisa Pfeiffer. I'm a Northwest Fisheries Science Center economist. My question is primarily for Joe, although perhaps Michael, Jodie, or others may have some thoughts too. I was wondering about your thoughts on the rockfish conservation areas in the wake of both quotas for the overfished species and the developments of the risk pools, and then in many senses more binding restrictions that the risk pools are putting on the activities of the fishermen.
I'm not sure I follow you completely, but I guess what I'd say is, and tell me if I'm on the right track, I think that the risk pool structure really opens up the opportunity to take a look at that relationship between the rockfish conservation area, rockfish rebuilding, and then the management system that we've now got in place. And what I'm hoping comes out of that is that we begin to have more analysis about what is actually being generated by those rockfish conservation areas in terms of stock rebuilding, and the extent to which we actually need to maintain very restrictive constraining species IFQ allocations in order to feel that we're adequately meeting the rebuilding requirements. And I can't claim to be up to speed completely on what's going on in that regard, but my sense is that there's room for a whole lot more work to see how productive the conservation areas actually are, and whether or not there really is a significant issue with take of constraining species, rockfish specifically, outside of those areas. It's an area where I think we've got to be careful not to confuse precision with accuracy. We get hung up on setting numbers based on IFQ allocations, and then we're managing to that number, and it makes us feel really good that we're addressing an issue where I think it's quite possible those areas would show there's sufficient productivity that the amount we're taking outside of them may not be significant, or maybe much less significant in terms of rebuilding than they actually are. And it kind of opens the door to take some of that pressure off of the IFQ allocation side of the equation. I don't know if that gets to the question you were asking. Yeah, okay, good.
Good morning, John Hindersheet with North Pacific Fishery Management Council. And my question sort of lies at the intersection of a couple of themes that have been addressed this morning. And that is, how can councils ensure that there's adequate analysis of the impacts of measures that are achieved through private agreements? And how can they ensure that there's adequate accountability to those that are sort of outside of that agreement but still have a public interest in the resource? And I was just wondering if, one or more of you could speak to sort of the public side of private agreements and co-management. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'd jump right in on that. I think actually the North Pacific Council is doing a very good job of surfacing a method for doing that. And I'd say it has two major components. One is very clearly expressing performance standards for these types of arrangements and putting a hammer behind it. You know, basically giving people targets to hit and saying there will be consequences if you don't hit this target. And having a fully participatory process when you're setting those targets and those performance standards, I think gives people a lot of assurance that there is something there, that there's real substance to this relationship. The other thing is the council has, in my knowledge, I think every time they've kind of incorporated co-management into the process has added a reporting function. And that reporting function sets up this iterative relationship where the cooperatives, for example, come into the council process on a regular basis and put it on the table. Here's what we did relative to the performance standards you gave us over the last year. And I'm really satisfied to see the level of dialogue that takes place following those reports. It's not formal regulatory rulemaking, but it's a clear expression, in many cases, from council members back to the participants and with public comment about, here's some areas where we think you could do better. Would you give this a try and come back to us in a year and tell us how you've managed? I don't know that there's a whole lot more that you do want to try and framework around that, because co-management is a very different space than regulatory rulemaking. And I think it does depend on much more of a collaborative communication back and forth and much more of an informal course adjustment as you go forward. But at the end of the day, critical part of this is that the councils, as in their role as councils, as policymakers and folks who initiate regulation, set performance standards that make it clear to the public how they're expressing that value that they're supposed to be addressing under MSA.
Not too much to add to that. I think that I would just say that I think I'm looking at David and Dorothy and Don and everyone else, that the council is very interested in the value that co-management can bring, but is also concerned about that question you had: what's the larger impact on the fishery and the public? One example, case in point, Erica Feller here led a process where she brought together a bunch of constituents asking for an exemption from the control rule for community fishing associations, basically a quota bank. And the argument being, well, this quota bank is trying to hold quota for a community and a group of fishermen in an amount that's, it should be an amount that's more, because we're trying to serve many fishermen. It's not just one single account. And the council spent a lot of time on it, over the course of a couple of years, and gave it really very deep consideration, and decided not to approve that exemption. And the reason being is there's too many unknowns and there's too much potential for abuse. And it was a completely reasonable decision, and I think it was a hard one for them to make. So the point being, I think they have their eye on that as well. As far as the reporting and things, one idea could be the council has approved that risk pools can have their own holding accounts of quota and it'd make running these things a lot easier. I won't go into the details. But to get that holding account for use in a risk pool, it could require a degree of reporting. That may be another way to get at it.
Hi, it's Margaret Spring, Monterey Bay Aquarium. First, I have a record-setting point to make, which is my presentation yesterday covering Magnuson-Stevens Act reauthorization covered a period of time when the Pacific Council was really in the depths of trying to work through some serious problems. So I totally apologize for not mentioning that, because I said to Don when I left. But there were a couple of things I wanted to point out during that period. First of all, we did have a field hearing on the West Coast, and this will go into my next question, which is at which NIMS admitted that they had not paid much attention at all and were prioritizing salmon over groundfish, which really shocked I think the delegation, and I know that's turned around a lot, so I was just curious how that's going, because I see the work that's been done. I also want to say that the industry-funded loan on the West Coast was really amazing, amazing work that was done with Congress to get that done. So that really helped move this along. But my second question was, and these are going to sort of be maybe for Don and then for Steve, which is when we passed the 2007 amendments, one of the reasons for promoting an ACL was the idea was that it would promote more data to improve stock assessments that would then improve the full catch accounting, would start catching up, and you wouldn't have as many data poor stocks. And I wonder if you're seeing that in some cases and if that is coming true, because that was intentionally set by Senator Stevens as an incentive point to get better data into the system using the North Pacific model. But in general, I see that you're ahead of this of the game now here, having put in an IFQ.
Well, I'll maybe start on that, and Steve might know more. Actually, John Stein here might know a bit more about the stock assessment part of that. But I think in general, we were pretty lucky in the Pacific Council with regard to the number of stock assessments prior to 2007. And we've seen certainly no drop-off in the amount of effort since then. Maybe there's been a little bit more. Anyway, we feel very good about that. I don't know if I could say that since 2007, the implementation of ACLs has generated higher quality or more stock assessments. I don't know that I've detected that where I sit, but I don't know if John or Steve might know actually more if you did a head count on that, what it would show.
Yeah, one of the issues there is that once you have an overfished stock, there's a requirement to revisit it. And so we had 6, 8 overfished stocks, and you had to come up with an assessment of it every 2 years. And we also went to a 2-year cycle. So all of a sudden we became dominated by having to revisit many of the stocks that were already being assessed. And so I guess I don't see that the requirement to come up with ACLs or overfishing limits through the SFA actually increased our throughput of stock assessments. I mean, one of the things that did help was the Northwest Center got to an annual combined trawl survey, which was a big deal. That helped create enough data to help us get a better fix on what was going on, because prior to that, as I mentioned, we had a triennial survey, and so it was few and far between. You didn't get new updated information very often, so that was also a pretty serious constraint on the science. So.
George Hunt from UW Fisheries. On the North Pacific SSC, we've had occasional discussions of a philosophical nature about prohibited species catch and whether it is a commodity to be traded, that is, to use as much as you can in order to get other fish out of the water, or if it is meant to be something that you do absolutely everything you can to minimize, because in the case of salmon, or even perhaps in your rockfish, you really want to leave as many of those fish in the water as possible so that the rebuilding happens faster. And so my question to you all is, what I'm hearing here right now is, let's use it to get the most other fish out of the water and take every last prohibited species or depleted species individually you can. Is that going to be the best in the long run?
Well, I'd like to start with the last part of your comment. I hope we didn't communicate that our objective here is to take every last bit of that constraining species in order to maximize your target species take. It's different. The idea here is that we are trying to get target species out of the water. They're important for the fishermen involved, they're important for the consumer involved, and so on. What we're trying to do is actually balance the goal of taking target species out of the water with the constraint that we're under relative to rebuilding. And that's the challenge that we're always facing under National Standard 1. It's optimum yield, but preventing overfishing. And I just see this as another iteration in the continuing tension under National Standard 1. I don't think we've got a different agenda than is reflected in that standard. The question at every juncture in the process is, how do you best achieve that? And there may be circumstances where you achieve it because of the circumstances you're in at the time, by saying absolute avoidance, minimization of catch of incidental catch of a constraining species is our highest priority because of the point we're at in rebuilding, for example. But I would hope we're managing on a spectrum as we're looking at that issue of that relative sensitivity on one hand and the importance of getting the constraining species out of the water as well. I think there are situations where, and I tried to address this too, it does not make sense to have a market. And I think we've got to be very careful about the tendency to move toward creating markets in anything that we address under kind of a cap and trade model as an approach that is going to get us the best result. And Bering Sea salmon, I think, is a perfect example. There simply is not, in my mind, space for a market there given the wide range of values that that fish has to all of the different users involved, including the extremely important cultural and even religious significance to the Yupik Eskimo culture, for example. So we're just faced with a situation where we have to do things differently, and I think we've got to be careful not to drop into some of the usual boxes that we might otherwise when we're faced with these kind of constraints.
Just one quick perspective from the West Coast, and I think maybe the North Pacific does have a lot more experience in this realm than we do. This IQ program of ours is just getting started, but in terms of prohibited species, I'll use halibut, for example. There was great fear that the number for halibut was not going to be enough, and that this was going to be the real problem with the fishery and why this IQ program would never work. But the bycatch, the unintended catch, or the species you're trying to avoid, has worked out very well. And the problem with Pacific halibut making this whole IQ program crash did not happen. And when you get down to the individual accountability part of this, the fishermen did kind of know where the dangerous areas to fish were, and were having enough success elsewhere that the halibut thing wasn't a problem. And in fact, I think for some of the other, I won't call them prohibited species, but yellow-eye canary, some of the other ones, everybody's so careful that at the end of the year, there are still some of those left. But it is a beginning program, and there still is a lot of target species that aren't being caught. Dover sole, huge amount of those, for example. So it's a beginning program, and I don't know what about to the north, but I would say that model of use them all very wisely to maximize your allowable catch, we haven't quite seen that yet. People are just too careful, I think, at this point.
I'd also comment that in the case of the rebuilding rockfish, I had a slide up there that showed the probability of rebuilding by Tmax for something like 8 different species, and there was quite a range. The most aggressive policy that the council could follow, I think, was rebuilding with a probability of 60% by Tmax, but some species, and I think dark blotch, case in point, it was greater than 90%. So there was, through the council decision-making process, some expression of not trying to get every overfished rockfish that they could during the exploitation of the healthy stocks.
Just to follow up, one of the things that was interesting in our discussions was the possibility of not just using a hammer, but using a carrot and rewarding in some way those vessels or sectors that were able to do a particularly good job.
It's not for me to answer that one then.
That sounds like a great idea. I can tell you that the risk pool, we sort of just accept the conflict, and the objectives listed in the risk pool agreement is maximize harvest of target species, avoid or use wisely or minimize, I don't know what the word is, the harvest of overfished species. So the conflict is sort of there, and I think I think Don said it well, is, how do we use these wisely so to maximize harvest of target species? We know in the risk pool that our overfished species take is going to go up as the harvest of target species goes up. And I think at the Nature Conservancy, it's been a real sort of soul-searching conflict for us because, what are we doing in the name of conservation? And I think where we've settled in is we're trying to improve the management structure, both through co-management and through, influence of the management structure and our own investments in science and research. And if we can improve our scientific understanding of these populations of fish, then the science, the guiding science that sets the total allowable catch will also improve. So it's really about investing in the system rather than taking action on your own to try to minimize the catch of overfished species.